Friends, I start from the Hegelian call on philosophers to be the watch guards of principles, especially when these principles look all fair and progressive. Here, the suspect at hand is the human rights, something which has been marked as the promise of progress, emancipation, and universalism. I shall argue that this position is myopic, exclusive, and informed by a series of global panics. In this small presentation, I shall unpack three normative claims on which the Human Rights Project is based and try to expose its dark side, especially the claim that human rights is part of modernity's narrative of progress. I challenge the three fundamental positions upon which the Human Rights Project has been perched. First, that the human rights represents a step forward in the progress of human development, civilizational maturity. Second, the assumption that human rights are universal and challenges its dehistoricized, neutral, and inclusive claims. Third, the challenge faced by the atomized, insular, liberal subject on which the Human Rights Project is based. And it is correlating assumptions about the other, who needs to be cabined lest she destabilizes or undermines this subject. At the end, I shall make some tentative proposals as to how we can engage with human rights once their dark side is exposed. The establishment of human rights in the mid-20th century as part of the modern project of international institutions was a critical moment. Everybody looked forward for that, and everybody was so very excited. It brought into being the possibility that states could no longer shelter behind the fig leaf of sovereignty, for violations committed against the individuals were caught and projected before the public. With the arrival of human rights, the state sovereignty could be cast aside and its acts be subjected to human rights scrutiny, all indicating that human rights marked a point of arrival, a step in the progress of human development. So this belief in the transformative and progressive potential of human rights is contingent on an assumption that we have, as a civilized world, move forward. So the ancient Vedic period and the literature were all, the reflections of some tribal, uncivilized, pre-civilized conditions, so on and so forth. So it's a narrative that has been that is driven by a persistent belief that history has a purpose and direction, Hegelian, coupled with an assumption that the world has emerged from a backward and more uncivilized era. And finally, that this progress has emanated from the heart of Europe. This new project no longer faces any ideological resistance, friends. See, now all these assumptions that I have read out are all by now accepted. There is no resistance whatsoever. Everyone chooses it happily. And there is a real earnestness on the part of the well-intentioned activists. I don't suspect all these the least. Practitioners, judges, and even politicians in pursuing this progressive, even righteous goal. But there are many who challenge the claim that human rights is a progressive project at all. As Jacques Derrida observes, in purely factual terms, more human rights violations have been committed in the 20th century. Mr. Tirumurthy gave a beautiful, gave me a platform to speak what I should. Being an academic, I'll be more blatant and harsh and not be very covering and indicative. So which is ostensibly the most human rights focused century, because this was this century where for the first time we started speaking about human rights, despite the fact that, as Derrida has pointed out, this is one century where a lot of violations have taken place than at any other point in human history. And it continues. Another reactionary critic views human rights as a tool that has eroded the legitimacy conferred to sovereignty. Who said that we were unhappy during the sovereign periods? And as a result, we have entered the age of uncertainty and instability. Human rights have caused uncertainties in the society in several fashions, creating refugees, single-parent families, absence of faith, homosexuality, and the list is long. Also, there are defenders of human rights discourse who clearly pursue a conservative agenda. There is a group of people who propose, apparently everything looks very neat and tidy, but then they have conservative agendas behind. I'll exemplify it with a letter written by Pope John Paul, with all due respects to Pope. This letter written to the Beijing's Women Conference in 1995, where he apologized to the whole clan of women on behalf of the church for have contributed to their historical oppression, and he called for real equality in every area. But in this letter, he distinguished his position from that of the feminists by casting itself as a preserver of the family. So he has agendas in his mind. What are the intentions of the Pope are clear. He wants to maintain sexual integrity and preserve the role of women in the family. Now things are clear. These responses exemplify how human rights are a contested terrain and not one that can simply be read in linear terms. A critical look at the recent history will reveal how the human rights discourse is permeated by imperial ambition. An explicit example of this complex narrative can be drawn from the bombing of Afghanistan in October 2001. The attack took place amidst claims by Western leaders that this was a crusade against the evildoers, a Christian battle against Satan. However, these claims of self-defense, they smell that something is wrong. No, this is not the way to justify it. So this self-defense soon gave way to discourse on human rights, which provided the tool for legitimizing the operation. The muscle-flexing talk thus came to be superseded by the gentler tones of women's rights. No one will contest. Shouldn't women have rights? Oh yes. Peace, religious freedom, and democracy that ultimately provided legitimacy for the intervention. At that time, US spokesman even commented that this led elections in Afghans. I do not know what really happened. I've read it. For the first time in 5,000 years, they went to vote until this redemptive moment when the cabin spirit of liberal internationalism, human rights, and democracy brought salvation to the Afghans. They were in the waiting room of history. See, what an altruistic exercise brought by the liberal West. Therefore, it was but on a small step from here towards Iraq. And we know exactly the same thing repeated in Iraq. But in Iraq, the language of human rights got muted when the daily civilian atrocities committed by the occupying forces were reported. When the media is doing great jobs, when the newly formed government failed to restore law and order, and when the legality of the war was continuously questioned and so on. So this noble endeavor of the altruistic West to bring democracy and freedom to the Middle East, and wherever there is darkness, they will bring their torch of reason, and that is the white man's burden, can in some way be compared to the attempts by the Indian government. I'm making a quick comparison between this altruistic West and the central government. I think the central government has changed its policies by now. To think that they thought that it is their duty to modernize the tribal people in the Northeast. They thought that we should give rights, human rights, to the tribal. The tribal rights are not all that fine. We'll have to modernize them, bring them to the mainstream. Little realizing that how comfortable the tribals are in their own places. So these critics constitute some of the tensions that characterize human rights law and disrupt the idea that human rights is one long and steady march towards progress. Now let us look at the second objection. When we unpack the notion of universality to which human rights claims are tethered, it looks very innocent. When we see that human rights bring a universal notion of humanity. But there is this underlying principle that all humans are entitled to enjoy human rights without regard to distinction. That is how we see it. Yet, when we examine the Enlightenment project, it exposes the exclusions that mark the history of this intervention. I'll make it more clear. Revisiting the colonial encounter, if we look at from the colonial, the post-colonial factor, things will be very clear. Revisiting the colonial encounter is critical in order to understand the limitations and possibilities of human rights in the contemporary period. It's not the case that human rights tries to restore something that's merely, it looks as if, that once upon a time we were all placed in the happy situation of human rights, and now they are trying to glue back together the broken humanity. That's not the case. We were never one earlier. Assertions about the universality of human rights simply deny the reality of the colonized, whom they claim to represent and speak for. See, the whole thing comes from the center, the Western mind, that there is some lack. They lack human rights, so they will have to be given some kind of right. So there is a deceitful act of disclaiming their histories. And in this whole exercise, our histories are lost and imposing another's through a hegemonizing move. And our histories have been replaced by the histories of our hegemonizer, the West. The argument is that the liberal tradition from which the human rights projects emerged has its footing on the Western convictions. This is my point. I repeat, the argument is that the liberal tradition from which human rights projects emerged has its footing on the Western convictions, on the cultural backwardness of the colonized and the racial and the religious superiority of the West. And also, assimilation is another agenda. How can you claim human rights? When you get assimilated to the Western culture. For instance, in the context of the colonial encounter in India, the universal principles of liberty, equality and freedom were contingent on the natives' ability to conform to the civilized white. Though we could never absolutely conform, somewhat we could conform to the white. That is all that we could achieve. So in the contemporary period, there is a proliferation of laws. We just look around, there is a proliferation of laws to protect human rights. That itself makes it suspect. A recent example is the fake charge of human trafficking in Nepal. There was one bus full of young Nepali women traveling from Nepal to New Delhi to get their flight to United Arab Emirates, because there were no jobs in Nepal. They were moving. But then they were stopped by an NGO who suspected human trafficking for prostitution. So these young women sought migration to the Middle East as a way out of their severe unemployment. Reportedly, they were rescued, in quotes, they were rescued and taken to the shelter of the NGO. Though the official later acknowledged that it was a mistake, but then they have lost their jobs, they have lost there is an economic loss related, and they even lost the jobs which were promised there. In brief, the commitment to human rights is not necessarily a commitment to a social justice project that is unequivocally liberatory. Also often, acts of reasserting human rights by their proposers, the altruistic white, are an eyewash. I'll just give you two examples. We often see the Western liberating states projecting themselves as torchbearers of human rights towards the less developed, non-democratic, illiberal world. When George Bush walks into a mosque immediately after the September 11, or when Tony Blair boldly asserts that the Muslim community will be embraced and diversity defended after the London bombings, we understand clearly the motives. It's not that they are trying to protect the human rights. We pretty understand their motives. Friends, when I take a walk on the darker side of this promising project, I am not arguing in favor of an outright rejection of human rights at all. We cannot not want human rights, double negation. For they are radical tools for many. We need, of course, human rights. And human rights, though a flawed ideal, seems preferable to no rights at all. It's a very useful vocabulary, yet it is all important to confront the dark side of this project that I'm trying to reveal before you. So today, to use the words of Costas Douzinas, human rights are being reduced to a body without a soul, without a political vision or moral purpose. There is a beautiful Indian critique of human rights initiated by Gandhi, but I'm not touching that. To question human rights is not to side with inhuman, the anti-human and evil. This critique arises from the realization that what's required at this moment is neither an arrogant triumphalism, we have arrived at a perfect and progressive principle, nor hopeless despair, but rather a thoughtful reflection. First, we need to move beyond debates between the universal character of human rights and their historical particularity. The universality that we see is, there are gray areas in that. The Human Rights Project will remain secular and non-productive if we linger in the debate about transcendence and immanence. More important, therefore, I argue, as a starting point, is to recognize that human rights are a site of power. Wherever you place it, it's a site of power. And because it is powerful, it matters who brandishes this sword. Human rights advocates have failed to adequately interrogate the colonial trappings, which I have highlighted. We will have to look into these. We'll have to interrogate the colonial trappings and first world hegemonic underpinnings in this project. And frequently, they ignore the non-West from the conversations. The non-West have been set aside in the conversations on human rights, and including even this error lingers on. Analyzing human rights from a post-colonial perspective provides an enriched perspective of how the terrain has operated. I'm concluding, we also need to understand that discussion on human rights has been so dominated by Western pontification about the project, which tied on to the claims that human rights are something needed only there. They are not speaking about human rights to themselves. They think that we lack it and therefore it is needed over there in the developing, in the less civilized world. The early William James, Indologists who wrote on Indian histories, who thought that we are uncivilized, I think still lingers on. Still, even that is even reflective in this human rights project. To sum up, they haven't changed their mind. So to sum up, the story of human rights cannot be told primarily through the dichotomies of good versus evil, heroes versus villains, and winners and losers. It is viewed that by centering excluded subjects, let the narrative start from the excluded subjects, excluded souls, and excluded histories in this project that can bring back to it a space of greater optimism and lesser despair. Ultimately, it is an effort to put some life back into a project in desperate need to give this body of human rights a soul. Thank you very much.